Everyone knows that school can feel like a prison. I certainly felt that way sitting in geometry class, watching the clock tick. We assume this feeling of powerlessness is just the natural order of things, and for thousands of years, the evidence suggests we were right. If you travel back 4,000 years to ancient Sumer, to the very invention of writing, you find the Adaba, the tablet house. This wasn't a place of creative exploration. It was a factory designed to produce human record keepers. The curriculum was crushing. Students had to memorize thousands of cuneiform signs, legal terms, and administrative lists. And the faculty list? It reads like a horror movie cast. There was the man in charge of drawing, the man in charge of Sumerian, and terrifyingly, a staff member whose official job title was literally the man in charge of the rod. We know this because the students wrote about it. A famous poem from the period, often called School Days, details the daily life of a Sumerian student. The student writes, "The man in charge of the rod said, 'Why did you speak without permission?' and beat me. The man in charge of silence said, 'Why did you stand up?' and beat me." It seems to confirm everything we think we know about the history of education. It was a top-down system where the institution held all the power and the student was just raw material to be beaten into shape. It makes perfect sense. After all, literacy was a rare technology, guarded by the elite. If you wanted to join that club, you had to survive the initiation. For centuries, this is what historians believed education always was, a tool of control. I believed this too, until I looked at a contract from the 11th century that shouldn't exist. When you look closer at the timeline of human learning, the prison model starts to crack. The first crack appears in Italy in the 11th century. This is the University of Bologna, traditionally dated to 1088 AD and widely considered the oldest university in the continuous Western world. But it didn't start as a campus built by a king or a pope. It started as a guild. In medieval Europe, if you were a foreigner in a city, you had no rights. If you were a German student studying law in Bologna and you got into a fight, the city could punish your innocent roommate just because he was also German. So, the students unionized. They formed a Universitas Scholarium, literally a community of students. And here is where the popular story of teachers in charge completely falls apart. At Bologna, the students hired the professors. They paid the salaries directly from their own pockets. And because they were the paymasters, they wrote the rules. I found records of these student-imposed statutes, and they are mind-blowing. Professors were fined if they didn't finish the syllabus on time. They were fined if they skipped difficult paragraphs in the textbook. They were even fined if they weren't interesting enough and the class size dropped below 5 students. This completely contradicts the Sumerian model. If education is just about elite control, why were these students allowed to dominate their masters? And it wasn't just Bologna. When we look at the Aztecs in Mexico, or the monasteries of India, or the barracks of Sparta, we don't find a single prison model. We find something much more complex. So if the top-down story isn't the whole truth, what actually happened? To understand the real power dynamics of school, we have to investigate what these civilizations were actually trying to build. Let's start with what we actually know about the purpose of these schools. In every case, the school wasn't just a building, it was a machine designed to solve a specific problem. In Sumer, the problem was bureaucracy. They invented writing not for poetry, but for accounting. The Adaba was brutal because errors were expensive. If a scribe recorded the wrong tax yield, the king lost money. So, the man with the rod wasn't a sadist, he was quality control in a human factory. The students had no power because they were the product, not the customer. But travel to 5th century India, to the great University of Nalanda, and the machine changes. Here, the goal wasn't to count grain, it was to understand the universe. Nalanda was massive, a residential university centuries before Oxford or Cambridge. It housed 10,000 students and 2,000 teachers. The library towers were said to be 9 stories high, containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. But here's the twist. Admission was harder than Harvard. Xuanzang, a Chinese scholar who visited, reported that the gatekeepers asked such difficult philosophical questions that 7 or 8 out of every 10 applicants simply gave up and went home. Here, the power lay with the institution, yes, but it was based on merit, not just obedience. Fast forward to the 15th century, to the Aztec Empire. Here we find something that breaks the elite-only rule completely. The Aztecs enforced mandatory education for all children, a radical departure from the era's norms. Centuries before the West even considered public school, the Aztecs required it. Why? Because the Aztec state needed 2 things: priests to keep the sun moving, and warriors to expand the empire. The Kalmukak taught nobles history and astronomy. The Telpuchkali taught commoners warfare and civic duty. It was strict, yes, but it was inclusive. Education wasn't a luxury for the rich. It was a duty for the citizen. And then we have the Spartans. The myth says they were illiterate meatheads who only knew how to kill. But when I dug into the sources, I found Plutarch telling a different story. He writes that they learned just enough reading and writing to get by. Why? Because an army needs communication. They are famously said to have used the Psi-tail, an early cryptography device used for sending secret messages during war. You can't use a cipher if you can't read. Even here, in the most militaristic society on Earth, education was a tool of state survival. So we have 4 different systems. In Sumer, the king paid, so the king ruled. In Tenochtitlan, the state paid, so the state ruled. In Nalanda, the religion paid, so the monks ruled. But in Bologna, who paid? And that's when I realized the truth. The power dynamic in a classroom isn't about tradition, it's about economics. In Bologna, the students were the customers. They weren't children, they were wealthy adults, often archdeacons or sons of nobility, far from home. They were paying for a product, law. And because they controlled the money, they controlled the product. The Universitas was essentially a consumer protection agency. The revelation is simple but profound. Education adapts to whoever holds the resources. It wasn't that the Bologna students were smarter or more rebellious, it was that they owned the transaction. In Sumer, the king owned the transaction. In the Aztec Empire, the gods owned the transaction. The school as prison model isn't a universal law of nature. It's just what happens when the student is the product, not the client. Suddenly, the fines for being late make perfect sense. If you ordered a pizza and it arrived an hour late with a slice missing, you wouldn't pay full price. The students of Bologna felt exactly the same way about Roman law. This changes how we look at our own education system today. We often argue about whether students should have more freedom or more discipline. But history suggests we're asking the wrong question. The real question is, what is the school for? Is it to produce obedient workers like in Sumer? Is it to build a cohesive society like the Aztecs? Or is it to empower the individual like in Bologna? We tend to think of the modern classroom as the advanced version, but in many ways, we have returned to the Sumerian model. Students are often treated as raw material to be processed for the workforce. The Bologna model, where the learner holds the reins, remains a radical exception. This history of education reminds us that the classroom is never neutral. It is a mirror of the society that built it. But the students of Bologna prove something else, that the power dynamic can be flipped. But Bologna wasn't the only place where the impossible happened. I'm here to help you know the secrets we've forgotten. What part of the modern school system would you change if you had the power of a Bologna student? Tell me in the comments. See you at the next excavation.